What if I told you that more and more countries are on the brink of financial collapse, and it's not just bad luck? From Sri Lanka to Argentina, entire economies are falling apart. But why? Is it reckless spending, global power struggles, or something more sinister? Stick around because the truth is shocking. Let's start with the biggest culprit, debt. And sure enough, global debt crosses the new $300 trillion, the highest ever recorded by the World Bank and the IMF. Countries are borrowing at alarming rates only to face the bitter reality they can't pay it back. When countries borrow money, they better do so in growth, explains Bitang M, who links borrowing money to keeping their existence. Sri Lanka's billions but mostly used spending instead of stimulating industries. At the due date for repayments, this country had no more assets left, which led to its bankruptcy in March 2022. Then, Pakistan was again bailed out by the IMF at least 20 times. Each time it repays a loan, it ends up taking another just to survive. This is a debt trap, and once a country falls into it, escaping is next to impossible. It isn't just a third world phenomenon. Not only the poorer countries are battling debt. Even the so-called developed countries, such as the US and Japan, have great debts. The difference? The economy is much stronger to carry it for now. But should the entire financial system of the world break down, we would see a chain reaction never imagined. Now, debt alone cannot kill countries. The real pain begins when countries start printing money to cover their losses. This creates inequality, which, left to itself, degenerates into currency devaluation of the richest countries in Latin America in 1990. However, after many years of reckless spending, the government printed money like it was going out of style. The result? The bolivar became worthless, with inflation at 130,000% in 2018. Just picture it, wheeling a barrow load of cash to buy a loaf of bread. But it's not just Venezuela. In a few years, Lebanon's currency lost over 98% of its value, while inflation in Argentina hit 211% in 2024, one of the highest rates in the world. So why does this happen? When a government simply prints more money, it reduces the value of the money already in the public's hands. Prices go up, leaving savings useless, and the poor suffer the most. Could the major economies like the US or Europe face such consequences? Some experts agree with that statement. With U.S. debt currently standing above $34 trillion, it is a balancing act by the Federal Reserve. If they print money too rapidly, inflation will rise. If they stop, growth will stall. It is a treacherous game in either scenario. It is unfortunate that even when all signs point to inflation or debt, sometimes the real enemy lies within. Poor economic policies and corruption have reduced nations to nothing from the heights they were capable of reaching. Take Lebanon, for example, the once nicer Switzerland of the Middle East. This banking system was completely sound until improper financial mismanagement by politicians began to lead to reckless financial decisions. In 2019, the banks came crashing down. They froze the life savings of people within a day, and to this day, such savings cannot be withdrawn by Lebanese citizens. The silent killer? Corruption. It has made Nigeria lose billions of dollars budgeted for public infrastructure somewhere. Instead of building roads and bridges and schools and hospitals, these leaders save the money outside the country and leave the economy to collapse. Argentina, for decades, has seen governments spend beyond limits, dragging this country, rich in natural resources, to a position where it is today broke, owing over $44 billion to the IMF's highest loan in IMF history. The result has been economic instability and creeping poverty that has reached the apex, leaving that country in one of the worst financial crises the world has ever seen. The inevitable result is that when leaders place their interests above the interests of the country, they bring in the collapse. And the worst part? At times, the people are always the most affected. Foreign loans, putting it mildly, are among the greatest causes of countries going bankrupt. Many nations turn to the IMF or the World Bank for help, but invariably, life support without a hidden cost, crippling interest payments, and tough economic measures marches hand in hand with such loans. Take Pakistan, for example. The country has received more than 20 IMF bailouts since the 1950s, and yet the conditions of its economy keep on deteriorating. Why? Because every bailout comes with some harsh conditions. For instance, higher taxes, cutting government subsidies, and last but certainly not least, devaluation of currencies. Such conditions practically keep the force of the economy unhappy, if not dead, by inflation and torture by citizens. Other than Pakistan, many countries in Africa and Latin America are struggling with austerity measures imposed by the IMF. These loans may extend temporary relief, but entrap the countries in a debt trap in the long run. The bigger problem? Almost all the borrowed funds are used on issues unrelated to development. This includes paying back interest and principal on previous loans, which makes any means of economic recovery impractical. In 2022, Sri Lanka could not continue servicing any debt and thus defaulted. Therefore, foreign loans do appear to be a life buoy, but turn into debt traps for hardly anything in the form of development assistance for these distressed nations. Even some good countries have been beaten by global events entering into the years. The pandemic and COVID-19 alone crushed $12.5 trillion worth of economic losses in the world. Lockdowns crushed small businesses, destroyed jobs, and caused record entries in government spending. Many countries were forced to sink even more money by then as a matter of just existing. Just as economies were getting back on their feet, the war between Ukraine and Russia worsened situations further. Countries whose lifeblood is Russian oil and gas felt the pinch as prices for energy shot up. Faced with acute fuel shortages, European countries had to pay billions more in energy imports, draining already weakened economies. Another huge area is disrupted supply chains. There was a famine in vital goods, and inflation moved even higher due to conditions created by the war and the pandemic. Food prices climbed, and imports stepped up prices. The large-scale wheat importer Egypt would face lower commodity imports of wheat emanating from the Ukraine-induced crisis affecting millions of people. Economic omena highlight the fragility of national economies in the increasingly intertwined economies of the world. When one country is hit by a crisis, then it tends to generate instability in the financial sectors of virtually all other countries. And when the country goes through an economic shock, it mostly ends up borrowing more, which adds to the debt problem. The fact that multiple bankruptcies may be flourishing under such an obscured place is the dollarization of trade. It is by the USD that imports and exports are settled, as well as payments for foreign debts of many countries. When the dollar becomes stronger, it is as bad news as possible for those economies that are debt-laden. For example, Argentina. Argentina is a country that has faced more than one economic crisis, but perhaps the most noteworthy of the lot may be the dollar dependency, which cripples them as most of their foreign debt is denominated in dollars. This means that a stronger dollar becomes an even tougher mountain to climb for repaying loans and keeping inflation at bay. This, in turn, brings about a massive 211% inflation in 2023 and a ticking time bomb regarding default risk. Others with problems similar to those now seek alternatives. BRICS, the 5 breakaway countries, namely Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, are implementing de-dollarization, which means reducing the dollar rate of trading to that of their local currencies. China and Russia, for example, have started doing trade directly using the yuan and ruble instead of the dollar. If a greater number of countries were to dispense with the USD for their transactions, finances on a global level could transform. The dollar, however, still enjoys worldwide supremacy, and the countries dependent on it suffer serious consequences as it strengthens. This is not an economic disaster only. In a country, bankruptcy quickly turns into a political and social disaster. Inflation rises and makes the essentials out of reach, turning into protests, riots, and mass uprising demonstrations. The perfect example is Sri Lanka. In 2022, that country had no foreign reserves left. It could even import nothing except fuel, food, or medicine. People suffered through power cuttings lasting up to 18 hours daily, shortages of food, and tremendous amounts of inflation. When such frustration built up, hundreds of thousands of protesters stormed the presidential palace, thus forcing President Gotabaya Rajapaksa to flee the country. The entire government gave in, and Sri Lanka had no other option than begging for an IMF bailout to live through this. This is how Sri Lanka is not an isolated example. In Lebanon, the economic crash triggered violent bank heists in desperation, wherein citizens stormed banks to have access to their frozen savings. In Argentina, where inflation is more than 200%, protests erupted against the government's mismanagement. Riots caused by food and fuel shortages are also rampant in Pakistan and Nigeria. It is a typical pattern, a clear case where economies collapse, governments slip out of their hands, and chaos takes over. This is the typical introduction, and it is quickly dropped into more unstable politics, leaving countries wide open for a coup, civil disturbance, or war. The larger fear cumulus, such as this, is likely to add to spheres of social unrest, deteriorating with economies almost collapsing. Which countries, therefore, are next in line for bankruptcy? Analysts in the finance sector warn that several countries have already displayed such serious warning signs of collapse. High external debt is another major red flag. Other countries, such as Egypt, Pakistan, and Tunisia, possess dangerously high ratios of debt to GDP and will pay far too much in terms of money owed compared to what they can realistically repay. Rapid inflation is another warning. Nations like Turkey and Argentina have aspects of hyperinflation that necessitate the citizens to produce expensive and unsustainable goods. On the other hand, there is the matter of foreign currency reserves. The country cannot import dollars when it runs out of dollars, just as in Sri Lanka. Panic has engulfed Nigeria's dwindling foreign reserves, while Bangladesh struggles with a widening trade deficit. So what can governments do to be disaster-proof? Economic reforms and self-reliance are the ways to go. Foreign debt should be reduced, local industries should be strengthened, and energy sources should be diversified to insulate the countries from the dragon macroeconomic shocks in the short future. Countries such as India and Brazil have been working to lessen the extent of foreign dependency while stabilizing the economy from outside shocks. But the real question is, will even the struggling nations act before it is too late? If history is anything to rely on, most governments wait until collapse is unavoidable. From IMF debt traps to global economic shocks, rising inflation, and mass protests, the world is seeing more nations on the brink of financial disaster. The big question remains, is this just the beginning of a bigger global crisis? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Like, share, and subscribe for more deep insights.